134th episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Jennifer Grossman. My friends call me Jag. I am the CEO of the Atlas Society. We are the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand, including fun, creative ways such as our animated videos and graphic novels. Today, we are joined by Michael Berenbaum. Before I even introduce our guest, I want to remind all of you who are watching us on Zoom, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, or YouTube, please go ahead, get in the queue, use the comment section to type in your questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Our guest today, Michael Berenbaum, is an American scholar, professor, rabbi, writer, and filmmaker specializing in the study of the Holocaust. At a young age, he served as deputy director to President Carter's Commission on the Holocaust, which led to his being appointed project director of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He is the director of the Sigi Ziering Institute, exploring ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust, and a professor of Jewish studies at the American Jewish University. Berenbaum is also the author of over 20 books, including this magnificent book, The World Must Know, which is the history of the Holocaust as told in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, scores of articles and hundreds of journalistic pieces. He's also been a producer and advisor to more than a dozen films and documentaries about the Holocaust. We met at the Reagan Library, which will soon be hosting the Auschwitz exhibit, which he has curated. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
So I'm so curious about the path that took you on such an extraordinary career. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your background, how you went from being born in the US at the end of World War II to playing such a prominent role in helping Americans understand the Holocaust more deeply.
I'll tell it to you briefly, but it's an interesting journey. I grew up going to Jewish day schools in the United States, in New York, and they were Hebrew-speaking Jewish day schools, which meant that my teachers were either survivors or refugees, but we didn't hear the term and we didn't know. We spoke a magnificent Shakespearean Hebrew. So the first time I came to Israel, I said, asking for directions, I said, if your heart inclineth in my direction, would you kindly indicate to me, my humble servant, what is the proper path that one should take to reach his anointed destination? Obviously, the Israelis laughed at me, but there was a quaintness to it. We heard words. The words we heard were death, children, and camps. We also were implicitly told that we were the generation of ice cream and whipped cream that had to make up for a generation that was lost. I also went to a very peculiar synagogue in New York, which was comprised and founded essentially by German and Belgian Jewish refugees who had escaped in 1938, 39, and 40. And because they were in the diamond business, they could escape with portable wealth. So they were trying to recreate in New York a world that was lost, but we never heard the words, we never heard the term. I became interested in a historical theological question. Why did the Jews not go out of business after defeat? And if you think back, Jews are one of the very few ancient people that have had continuity after multiple defeats and have rebuilt, transformed, and changed in the aftermath of defeat. I'm working on this, and a fellow says, Michael, you're not asking an ancient question, you're asking the modern question. The Holocaust was the enormous defeat of the Jewish people. Millions were killed. An entire world of European Jewry, which had been the center of Jewish life, was destroyed. And you're living through the rebuilding and the like. So I said, look, I'm not interested in modern history. I'm interested in ancient history. I've learned these crazy languages. Leave me be. He said, why don't you start reading? I started reading, and I realized that I had been subliminally asking the modern question. That led to, by fortune and good luck, and that's a different story, led to me to do two things in the early part of my career. One was to tell the story that could not be told to me to the American people in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in an idiom that they could understand. And then after we had done that, I left to work for Steven Spielberg's Survivor of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, which gave the survivors the opportunity to tell the story to the world and leave this incredible historical record, and to tell their story to the American people, a story they could not tell to me as a child. And it became, this only makes sense retrospectively. I never thought of it going forward. But in retrospect, the unspoken, the unsaid, the unarticulated, the not yet capable of being articulated gave me the direction for my professional career.
Well, let's rewind even a little earlier than the museum. Maybe you could share a bit about how President Carter appointed you at such a young age to serve on the commission.
Well, that's an interesting story itself. Think of it, we're about to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the State of Israel. And Jimmy Carter had Menachem Begin coming to the White House in May of 1978 to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the State of Israel. Carter had been in some political trouble with the Jews because he had mentioned Palestinian rights. And he didn't particularly like Menachem Begin, in part, I think, because they were very much alike. Deeply religious men who saw themselves in historical terms and had a certain sense of stubbornness to them. And I don't mean that judgmentally, I mean that descriptively. He asked a question, and this was the month after the docudrama The Holocaust had appeared on television. Docudrama appeared on television. All of a sudden, people were interested in hearing the story of survivors. So some staffers, and you've been a staffer in a political White House, some staffers approached him with the idea, maybe we should create a memorial to the Holocaust. He bought the idea. And he said, I'd like to, he said he was going to create he invited 1,000 rabbis to the White House, God help him. And he said he was going to create a President's Commission on the Holocaust to recommend an appropriate national memorial to the Holocaust. If it was the Holocaust, he first approached Arthur Goldberg. Arthur Goldberg said it had to be Elie Wiesel. He appointed Elie Wiesel chairman, and Elie Wiesel wanted a man by a major Jewish thinker by the name of Yitz Greenberg to be chairman, to be director. And I was a young scholar at Wesleyan University. I knew Yitz Greenberg well. I had written a book on Wiesel's thought, and they looked for a young man who could do the job, move down to Washington and spend full time on it. So I got the appointment through the recommendation of Elie Wiesel and a fellow by the name of Rabbi Professor Yitz Greenberg, Irving Greenberg. And I came down to Washington, and we made four basic recommendations. Number one, we said we would create something in Washington, not in New York. So we said essentially that we could take the memories of the Holocaust and bring them to the center of American national life, and they would have something to say to the American people, not just to the American Jewish community. Secondly, we wanted a living memorial. A living memorial means a museum to tell the story of the Holocaust, an academic center, an educational center, as well as a memorial itself. Jimmy Carter probably expected that we would create a statue of some sort, but we felt very strongly that a memorial works for the first generation that knows the story. But afterwards, it joins a number of statues in Washington, with the exception of Lincoln and Washington and Vietnam. And we'll have to see what Vietnam means another 20 years from now when the generation of Vietnam is gone. With the exception of that, name the other Washington monuments, and who knows who Ulysses S. Grant was or something like that. Obviously, you do and I do because we're deeply ingrained in history, but most people just pass by. It's another statue, a man on horse, or whatever have you. So we recommended the creation of a living memorial in Washington, museum, education center, academic center, and days of remembrance, which was an observant in churches and synagogues and civic settings of the Holocaust as a commemoration. And lo and behold, it took us 14 years, and we got land donated by the American people, but the funds for the creation of the museum were donated by private funds. We built a museum which was controversial until it opened. And then we had a wonderful problem, which is we had an abundance of attendance. And we said, we want you all, but please don't all come at once. And I ironically left the museum, left the President's Commission for a time, came back in after Elie Wiesel resigned as chairman because they needed a scholar who could articulate and shape the memory of the Holocaust for the American people, preserving what was distinct and unique about it. And I had this wonderful opportunity in my 30s to create on a scale I had never imagined. And it was the rare privilege of my life.
And since then, I understand you've advised and been involved with quite a number of other Holocaust museums.
Well, I had an existential problem, which is, what do you do after you've done everything you wanted to do? So I'd been geared up for 14 years thinking in terms of the museum. We opened it. It was a smashing success. I'm in my early 40s. I'm too poor and too young to retire. And the question it becomes, what do I next want to do? I then got this tremendous opportunity to develop the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, take the testimony of 50,000 Holocaust survivors. We took 52,000 testimonies in 57 countries in 32 languages, and we amassed the largest historical record of visual testimonies ever and the largest historical record of oral testimonies ever. Think of it this way, that there are 36 oral histories of people who were slaves in the United States. And we have by now about 80,000 testimonies of Holocaust survivors, all in video format. Now, I want your audience to conceive of what that represents. First of all, it's a difference between an elite history and an every person's history. Normally, historians work with elites. They work with people who wrote letters, with people who compiled documents, who wrote diaries, who did historical events. But we have everybody from the most historically important people who survived to Joe the baker and Chaim the tailor and Chaya the seamstress and everybody in between. So we have an ordinary thing, an ordinary historical record. Now, these are ordinary people who lived through some of the most extraordinary events imaginable. And what we have also, which is fascinating and will be worked on in future generations, is we have their testimony when they're in their 50s. And now we have their testimony when they were in their 70s. And now we have their testimony when they're in their 90s. And somebody's going to think about how do you transmit memory when you're young and future-oriented, and when you reach your 90s, you finally may come to the conclusion that you have more yesterdays than tomorrows. And also, what do you want to leave as your legacy if this is the last that one hears of you? And the other part of this testimony, which is incredible, is you and I hopefully only go through life or death situation once or twice in our life, and maybe not at all. They lived in a life and death situation almost on a daily basis. I use the word hungry, it means I missed lunch. They ate in 41, they ate again in 45. Sometimes when they ate in 45, they literally could not digest it and it killed some. So I use cold, it means today's a wonderful day, it's raining in California. It means I should put on a raincoat. If I didn't put on a raincoat, I'd get wet. They worked in pajama-like uniforms in the dead of a Polish winter, when it's 10 degrees out or 15 degrees below zero. And I use the word cold, it means I need a sweater. They use a vocabulary, so they experience something extraordinary. And then to complete my career after I did that, I asked, well, I guess you know something. And by then I knew something about museums. I knew something about filmmaking. And I want to remain a working scholar, a working stiff. So I said, I should shape my life around the three noted skills I have. And that's what I've been doing for the last 22 years and have had fabulous opportunities. And people think that I know something. And I've now reached the stage where not only will people seek my advice, but they actually may listen.
So perhaps the only book that I have read as many times as Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand is Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. And I find it's a book that I turn to when I'm facing, not necessarily a life or death situation, but a challenging situation. And it's interesting because it's in part the story of this very accomplished psychiatrist who loses everything, loses his wife, loses his children, loses his manuscripts, and almost loses his life in the concentration camps. And yet he manages to still hold on to his humanity and his belief in humanity. And the line that always stayed with me was that man is the same person who built and ordered people into the gas chambers, and also the person who went into them with his head held high and the Shema Yisrael on his lips. So I guess my question is to you. You have been immersed with so many of these heartbreaking stories. How do you manage? Do you ever get overwhelmed? Do you ever find it depressing? And how do you take something away that keeps you going?
Well, let me answer the third question first. I have found the material compelling. And however much I know, I realize how little I know. And consequently, as an academic and scholar, there is more to learn, and I learn it all the time, which is what keeps me going. There's a danger with this material, and the danger is that you can really despair of humanity and experience the depth of inhumanity imaginable. I had a wonderful privilege as a young scholar, disturbing my wife enormously, which is I would be working in archives and reading all day, and I would come home and I had little kids and I would wake them up and play on the floor because I needed to touch vital life and not be surrounded by death. I also developed something which psychologists call entombment, which is you put your professional life in a tomb and you try to make sure you keep it there and it doesn't break out into the rest of your life. It's this type of thing that physicians have who deal with life and death all the time. And I gradually had to make sure that my limitation on feeling that happened when I put it in a tomb didn't affect the rest of my life, where feeling was quite not only expected, but was absolutely necessary. And if you have young kids, you need to be about hope and future and vitality and all of that. If you're married, you can't say, I cover my feelings like this and nothing can get to me. So you have to balance that. And the other thing that I have to balance creating in this field is to understand how the audience is going to respond, or audiences are going to respond in a way that I don't respond because I'm familiar with this material. So I have to put myself into the shoes of the audiences in order to be able to predict how they will respond to it, and make sure that you have to, in one sense, describe and depict and portray dehumanization without re-dehumanizing the audience and without re-dehumanizing the victim. And let me give you a very peculiar example. One can create an erotic movie without revealing an incredible amount. The first attraction, the first embrace, the first kiss, the first sense that the relationship is going somewhere, depicting the outpouring of love the morning after, and leave the rest to the imagination, which becomes ironically an erotic imagination. One can also engage in pornography, which leaves nothing to the imagination and which ultimately becomes boring. So we have to, when we create with this, we have to present violence and dehumanization and degradation and destruction in such a way that we don't redo it and make it just one, overwhelming sense of it, and leave some to the imagination of the audience. And also we have to present the multiple narratives of the Holocaust, because some, like a Viktor Frankl, may have maintained their humanity, and others may have lost them. I mean, I just read a memoir in which a fellow said, "My best friend was Ernest. I depended on him and I loved him. And I'm happy that that my life was not that desperate that I stole his shoes." Now you have to maintain both senses. I loved him. He sustained my humanity, And if I had reached rock bottom, I might have even stolen his shoes. Now, once you understand that, you understand an awful lot about what happened in this circumstances. So you have to maintain a certain balance. And as I tell you, you also have to understand that there are 3 levels of audiences. And you know this phrase because I've used it in conversation with you. There are skimmers, swimmers, and deep divers. So when we create a museum, we try to create on 3 levels. So that if you want to get the point, it hits you, boom, 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 boom. If you really want to understand it, we offer more and even more, so that somebody can spend an hour in a museum and somebody can spend 6 hours in a museum and learn something in a very deep and profound way. It's different, for example, than when I teach a class. If I teach a graduate class, I'm only interested in the deep divers.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a skimmer, don't take a graduate course. If you're a swimmer, you're not going to do well in a graduate course. It's only the deep diver. And the deep diver in a graduate course is somebody who reads the footnotes.
Yeah, no, I love that phrase because it helped me to articulate something that I had been sort of instinctually doing with our work here at the Atlas Society, but without the words to be able to explain it. And that there are people at different stages, different temperaments, different levels of interest, people who've never heard of Ayn Rand, people that have never heard of the Holocaust. And then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are deeply interested, erudite, and accomplished objectivists. And so,
and then there are different ways that people learn.
right.
Some people learn by seeing, some people learn by touching, some people learn by hearing. And you have to, and we have in Washington, people always remember a display of shoes. We have 5,000 pairs of shoes, and what people don't realize is that one of the powers of that exhibition is the fact the shoes are deteriorating. May deteriorate over 100 years or 50 years or whatever have you, and they give off a smell. And you don't sanitize the smell, you smell it. And if you think of it, one of your most acute senses is your sense of smell. It protects us as human beings from all sorts of things. The reason we don't eat spoiled food. It's the reason that we engage in certain elementary elements of sanitation. So people learn by different ways and the like. One thing we can't do in a museum really is to taste, which obviously is, and if you think back to, we just finished the holidays. Now, the holidays for many people are about smells and taste. You come into a home and you smell the meal that's about to happen, and then you eat that meal. And it's about smell and taste and visual and all of that. We also had a very interesting thing in testimony. Greek Jews did not have a common language with the rest of the victims. Most Central Europeans could understand either German or Yiddish, or a combination thereof. And some Central Europeans spoke 6 or 7 languages as they got up in the morning. We have a survivor who said, look, I lived in 5 countries and I never moved out of my home. Because we in the United States imagine borders from, the Atlantic to the Pacific, right? In certain areas of Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, they changed hands 4 or 5 different times without moving whatsoever. So the Greek Jews will always give you a visual description of what was happening because they didn't pick up cues by hearing. And consequently, their depictions are enormously visual. And when you listen to that, you can almost draw what they're seeing in a way that you don't with other victims, because they had multiple senses by which to describe what they were experiencing.
All right, we're halfway through, and I definitely want to talk about the Auschwitz exhibit and what people can expect and what the reception has been. But I'm going to take a break and get to some of the questions that are coming in, because there are quite a few, including David Farouz on Facebook asking, is it becoming harder to impress onto new generations the significance of the Holocaust as more survivors grow old and disappear? So really just, how your mission has changed.
That's a profound question. And the profundity of the question is that we are in a transition. We are going from living history to historical memory. And we're also going where the recipients of historical memory are more institutional than personal. In other words, museums, memorial universities, scholarship, education, etc. But the authority of someone who was there is a very different authority. That's the bad news. The good news is that no generation has left behind a greater historical memory. And we will be able to create with this material for the foreseeable future. And I can tell you, without bragging, that I have won 2 Emmy Awards by learning how to get out of the way. And that is that we did 2 films of survivor testimony, which took no talent on my part, but only the recognition of talent on the part of the survivor, and learning that you shouldn't interfere between them and the camera, and merely suggest a couple of things all the way through, because they were just tremendous storytellers, and you had to get out of the way. And these are, one of them even won an Academy Award, but precisely not because of our talent, but because of our recognition of somebody else's talent, and the like. So they have the capacity to tell the story. I'm worried about something very different. I'm less worried about Holocaust denial today in the hardcore sense of denial than I am about Holocaust trivialization, vulgarization, and falsification, and also the sense of demeaning it. And we see that from the right, we see that from the left, we see that in all sorts of misuse of it. And one of the achievements of the last generation was the Holocaust became, in my words, though I'm not, in my words, the negative absolute in a world of relativism.
Interesting.
We don't know what's good, we don't know what's bad, but the one thing everybody can agree upon is that, or most people can agree upon, Nazism was bad, Auschwitz was, and this is where we come to the exhibition, Auschwitz was the capital of evil. It was the embodiment of evil in our world, of 20th century humanity, of modern civilization, and the like, and therefore it becomes not only of implications to Jews and Germans, but of implications to all human beings. And notice the title of our exhibition, Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away. Now that title is a scandal. Unfortunately, it's accurate. What should we want of Auschwitz? We should want Auschwitz to be long ago and far away. But we have echoes of Auschwitz in our world today. But the echoes of Auschwitz have to be serious echoes of Auschwitz, not the trivial echoes of Auschwitz. So, for
Right.
example, let's take an example from the left and an example from the right. So we'll be equally critical on both sides. You take somebody like Whoopi Goldberg, who said, and I don't need to engage in whether her intentions were pure or not pure. I'm describing the thing. So Whoopi Goldberg said that the Nazi attack against the Jews was not racism. She saw racism in the American context as black and white. When anybody who knows something about the Holocaust understands that in 1935, the German Reichstag passed what was called the Nuremberg Laws, which defined Jews biologically based on the religion of their grandparents, not by the identity they affirmed, not by the religion they practiced, not by the traditions they embraced, and led to the bizarre situation but by the religion of their grandparents, which led to the bizarre situation that Roman Catholic priests, Roman Catholic nuns, including a Saint Edith Stein, and Protestant pastors were all defined as Jews, even though the church tried to defend them as Christians. Why? Because the definition of Jew was by blood, and you had the sense of mongrels, of pure-blooded Jews, and then mixed breeds or mongrels called Michelin. Nazism was all about race. It was a hierarchical of race, with the Jews being the lowest form of race, meaning the race that had to be eliminated because they were regarded as cancerous. So again, somebody who says it's not about racism doesn't understand how integral race was. 28 institutions of higher learning had racial science trying to prove the supremacy of the Aryan race. And it was a combination of eugenics and euthanasia that were personified. Let's take the opposite. However you feel about masks were not yellow stars. Yellow stars existed. And by the way, in Poland, they were white armbands, so we shouldn't only say yellow stars. But yellow stars existed because you can't tell Jewish identity from the outside. It's not either the color of your skin or the nature of your eyes, and the like. So consequently, they marked Jews, and they ultimately marked them for extermination. First exclusion, then ultimately extermination, which we would call annihilation. So trivializing it makes it, anybody who says that is talking about their own foolishness, whether you like masks or not. Nobody was being identified to be murdered because they were or were not wearing a mask. Right. This was a way of targeting people ultimately for annihilation. So I can use 1,000 examples of trivialization and vulgarization, and I'm much more worried about that because what it does is to reduce the moral capacity of the Holocaust to shock and to engender a certain measure of responsibility, and therefore it ends up in trivialization and vulgarization. So that's my concern every day.
I have an example of that. Probably have a few, not as many as you can muster, but I remember working with a former chief of staff to President Obama, who had heard of me but hadn't yet met me. And when he met me, he said, "Oh, here's the leader of the Hitler Youth Brigade," knowing that I was active in Republican politics. And to his credit, when I reminded him that I was Jewish, he was very embarrassed and apologized profusely. But what bothered me was not so much this awkward application of this label to someone who's Jewish, but precisely this trivialization, this cavalier use of Hitler analogies to a stranger that you don't know anything about.
That's
so,
right. And again, and it's when that happens, it stings. And it also reflects on the person who doesn't quite understand what the impact is. Look, I can disagree with you, but to call you, and why do you call somebody a Nazi? It's a way of screaming. It's just, it's become a way of screaming. In the same way let's take an interesting example. It's clear that the Russians are committing war crimes, attacks against civilians. It's not quite as clear that they're committing genocide. I can give you multiple evidence. I know the legal definition, terminology, but war crimes are clear: to destroy the infrastructure, stuff like the electrical supply and the water supply, especially during the winter, is essentially a war crime of a certain magnitude to attack civilians on that basis, etc. That's not quite genocide. Different than, for example, what's happening in China. But again, you don't want to lose the moral import of that. Hitler was Hitler. However much you dislike what Putin is doing, Putin is not Hitler. Putin is Putin. Now, you and I, when we went to school, learned to compare and contrast. And compare and to contrast is not to equate.
interesting.
And
All right. Well, the question of war crimes versus genocide actually ties into another question we have here from Facebook. Candace Morena asking, in America, learning about the Holocaust has become an integral part of everyone's upbringing. It seems, well, I'm not sure, but
would that it were the case?
Yes, I wish that were the case. But she wants to know, why do you think that the Ukrainian Holodomor or other genocides, such as in Armenia and Rwanda, are not as widely known?
I think it has to do with a couple of things. Let me just explain to the audience what the Holodomor was. The Holodomor was the deliberate starvation of Ukraine, of people in the Ukraine by Stalin and his henchmen in order to essentially change the way in which food was grown in the Ukraine. The secret of the Ukraine is the Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe. It's the reason precisely that in the 1930s, Stalin wanted to control, and it's the reason why Hitler wanted to control the Ukraine in the 1940s. And we've seen the implications in the current war of what happens when you attack the Ukraine and you don't give it the capacity to export grain. That would have led, if we did not have an agreement, would have led to massive starvation in Africa, because the Ukraine soil is the equivalent of the soil of our Midwest of Iowa and the like, and you know, we can this type of soil can feed the world if what? If the products of that soil, the food grown on that soil, can get out. There are a couple of reasons why it's not quite as well known. The first is that the Holocaust occurred over 12 years and 23 different countries. It impacted two of the great monotheistic religions in the world, in a minor way the Islamic world, but Christianity and Judaism. It occurred in the most scientifically advanced and with the greatest musical, philosophical, and intellectual tradition as a 20th century phenomenon. It occurred in the open. It occurred when film existed. And it occurred with two people who were deeply committed to documentation and memory. Ben Ferencz, who was the lead attorney at the largest mass murder trial in the world at Nuremberg, the Einsatzgruppen trial, essentially closed the prosecution in 2 days. He asked one question: is this your signature? And as he compiled it, he had, among the people on trial, he essentially had the equivalent of about signatures for about the murder of 1.8 million Jews, some Soviet commissars, and some Roman Sinti known as gypsies. 2 days, one question. They were convicted by what? Their own documentation, because they what? They were, in a very deep sense, proud of what they were doing. The best example of that is Heinrich Himmler in October 1943, gave a speech to the SS in which he said, "This is a chapter of German history never to be written, never to be told." Now, Jennifer, you can ask me the question, if it's never to be written, never to be told, why is it that I know about it? Because Himmler in the back of the room was so proud of what they had achieved that he had it recorded. But he didn't have it recorded the way you and I record things now on a little phone that we can put in our pocket. He had it on a machine that was this large and that created essentially the equivalent of a record, because he wanted to make sure that it was documented. So we have his notes, we have his recording, and we have the response because they wanted to brag about it. Jews are fascinated by history. And the single example of that also is that there was a group in Warsaw called the Oneg Shabbos, the Joy of Sabbath, a group that documented everything, that compiled the historical record. And when the ghetto was being destroyed, they buried it in milk cans and in metal boxes, understanding that they would not live, but that Jewish history would continue to exist, and they wanted their story to be told, not from the perspective of the killers, but from the perspective of the victims. And therefore, the commitment to memory and documentation is unequaled.
Makes sense.
You have records in 30 different countries of what happened. You have massive amount of documentation, and there was a commitment from the very early on period of time to tell the story. And that's why it has a larger memory. The Armenian community has slightly caught up with that. Mass communication was not as strong in the 19-teens as it was in the 1930s and 40s. The same thing in the Holodomor, and the Holodomor had a longer period of suppression. Plus, even the Americans made a deliberate effort to record it. The best example is that Eisenhower invited the moguls of Hollywood and all the newspaper publishers to invite it as a polite word. He insisted that they get their rear ends over to the camps and see. Joseph Pulitzer said, when I was reading this, I thought it was an overstatement. And now I recognize that it was an understatement. You had the greatest of the filmmakers, George Stevens, Frank Capra, of that generation, who joined the Army in the Army Signal Corps. And the Army Signal Corps recorded everything. And by the way, since we were talking about the President Reagan Library, President Reagan, when he was a young actor, this is in the 1940s, was present when they developed this film, the Army Signal Corps film. And he made a psychological mistake, which he later corrected, because he said, I was there. Mm-hmm. but that's the power of the film, of what he saw. And he truly believed, in one sense, he was there because he was there when we were seeing it when Americans were seeing it for the first time, and it was broadcast in our theaters. Now, what is the difference between now and then, which is incredible, is now everybody's broadcasting. In other words, I now have the power to communicate to the entire world what I'm seeing and put it out there. I don't need a film crew. I don't need a camera crew. I don't need everything. That's why, in one sense, we're sometimes oversaturated with information that is taking place, and we lose the power of story, which is context and prelude and whatever have you. I'll give you a funny example of, which is, to say funny is, when I was a kid, I was 16 years old. I was involved as a victim in a holdup. And that is, I was in a store where people came in with guns and held us up. And it made no sense to me, because I'm used to a plot from a holdup. When I see a holdup on television, I'm used to the change in the drama of the music. I'm used to the pre-story. I'm used to the post-story. And it took me, I don't know whether it was 1 minute or 10 seconds, to realize this is real, but it had no context, no plot, no narrative, no story. And consequently, I was unprepared to see what I experienced as being the victim of a holdup. And it's only after police interrogation, and I was being interrogated not as a perpetrator, but as a victim, only after police interpretation did I begin to understand that I was giving them a narrative, which is the way in which we experience it, but thoroughly unreal, when it could have cost me my life.
Wow. Yeah, that is an interesting analogy. Now we have 8 minutes left, and so I'm going to just give a blanket apology to all of the people who asked really great questions this time that we're just not going to have enough time to get to, because there are two things. One, I definitely want to hear about the exhibit, and maybe we'll close with that. But first, we haven't talked that much about your film career and your involvement with all of these projects over the years. So would love to hear a little bit about maybe some of your favorite projects, some of the most memorable projects, future projects, and even perhaps, other fictional, because I know you've done documentaries and movies that in many cases were based on real people, but some fictional treatments in literature, let's say, of the Holocaust that
So
were meaningful.
let's do that briefly. I am
Thinking of
much
Leon
more,
Uris in particular.
I'm much more directly involved in documentaries, meaning that I'm usually the producer and the academic advisor for documentaries. And I have all the raw material, and I've probably created, if you think of museums, which sometimes have 40 and 50 films, I've probably created hundreds of short films on the Holocaust, and probably about 20 or 25 longer documentaries in which I've been heavily involved. I'm normally consulted on fictional elements to advise them on what to do, and more importantly, to advise them what not to do. Tell you a funny story. My wife came to our marriage with a handyman. And one day the handyman said to my wife, "Do me a favor and call me before your husband starts to fix something. It'll be cheaper and faster." I had a
Jewish fix-it.
I had a peculiar break in that way, and that is that people came to me, I won't mention the film, where they had made all sorts of major mistakes in the film chronologically and visually, and they had to spend a fortune. They, for example, had Jews in Poland with yellow stars when Jews had white armbands. They had Jews in occupied Poland, they had Jews in pre-invasion Poland with yellow stars, which didn't happen. It only happened after it. And they had to redo a whole range of things. And I developed the reputation where somebody wants to do something serious, consult him before rather than after. And right now we're working on a very interesting film. And actually, the film is about women who, in starvation, resisted by preserving their recipes. And this is an international phenomenon. We'd already done a documentary on it. And that is that, ironically, women in starvation do something very intriguing to preserve their dignity, which is they preserve their historical record. What is the historical record of many women? It's cooking. And they remember when they had food, when they had family, when they had kitchens, and the like. And we are going to now be telling the story of one such woman who created a record. And when she died, she insisted that it be given to her daughter, who was not there. And it only was given to her about 25 years later.
Wow.
With somebody saying, I have a present for you from your mother. What is the present? The present are the recipes of Central European women, with all that represents. It's another way of saying we preserve our culture. So I'm deeply involved with that. I have a movie that is going to be shown this Saturday night called Reckoning, which is in Miami at the Jewish Film Festival, which is the story of the negotiations between the Jews and Germans in 1950-51 for the question of restitution, and the battle that happened over the question of restitution, with Jews desperately needing funding for the absorption of immigrants by the state of Israel and also for survivors to get on with their lives, and Germany needing, as it were, to restore itself to the family of humanity after the atrocities, but they're being unable to talk to each other because of all that was involved. And this was the first formal meetings between Jews and German. It took the great leadership of Konrad Adenauer and also of a combination of David Ben-Gurion and Nachum Goldman, and no less a figure than Menachem Begin called it absolution. And it turned out that this worked out as reparations, worked out to strengthen survivors, strengthen Israel, and give Germany a way of repentance and restoring and creating a future antithetical to the future that it had under the Third Reich. So I keep working on these, and it's very interesting. And I have various roles in that, and lots of people consult me.
Wow.
Lots of people consult me to make sure they don't make mistakes. And the last point I want to make is my first advice to every filmmaker is don't add drama, merely let the drama speak forth. You screw it up when you add drama, but when you let the drama come forth, then you can do it right.
Well, that is a wonderful bit of advice to end on. I want to let everybody know that the Auschwitz exhibit at the Reagan Library is going to be opening on March 24th. And this is an exhibit that has attracted thousands and thousands of visitors. And I think it's been Kansas City and was it in Spain or?
New York, in Madrid, and in Malmo. And now it's coming to California. It has 700 artifacts. And it is at the risk of, let me give my colleagues complete credit for doing it, but they deserve the credit because essentially we have told the story of Auschwitz in an enormously powerful and complete way. And it's an exhibit that won the International Award for Europe, and that drew 600,000 people in Madrid, sold out in Kansas City for 8 months, and is now in Malmo, which is, interestingly enough, the most anti-Semitic city in the European continent. And the mayor brought it there in order to address the anti-Semitism in his city and his country. And it's playing a dramatic and important role. It's an exhibit you don't want to miss if you're in the California area.
Beautiful. Well, fantastic. We will stay tuned. Michael, I don't notice a big social media presence. I wouldn't necessarily expect one, but what's the best way to keep tabs on you? Maybe set in a Google alert?
A Google alert. I'm redoing my website. It'll be up in about another month with all of the different activities that I do.
Okay, wonderful.
And it's fun.
Well, thank you so much, not just for this interview, but for your mission and the incredible contribution that you've made to America and to the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you who joined. If you enjoyed this video or any of our other materials, please consider making a tax-deductible donation at atlassociety.org, and make sure to join us next week when rapper and comic book impresario Eric July will join us on the next episode of the Atlas Society Asks. We'll see you then.